Okay, today we're going to look at how to do an IOC in poetry for DP, English A Language and Literature. Some general points to remember before we begin. It's really important that you have a clear structure. And I'm going to give you an example of a structure later. You don't have to use the same structure, but it's really important that you have a clear structure. This will make sure you talk about everything. It will keep you focused. And apart from anything else, if you look at the rubric, criterion C is structure. Make sure you have a strong thesis statement. Again, I'm going to show you later an example of a thesis statement. And it's really important because this is what links everything together. Your thesis statement is what makes sure that you are focused and that everything you say has a purpose. Give some background to the poet and link this to the poem if it's relevant. So mention a bit about the poet. Remember, this is not a biography. That's not the point of this talk. And link this to the poem you're discussing if it's relevant, if there's a purpose to it. And the IB are very specific about this. They're very explicit in their DB handbook. You can talk about other poems that you may have studied or may not have studied, but only if it's relevant to what you're discussing in the poem you've been given, to make sure that your thoughts don't get hijacked and you don't end up talking about something that is completely irrelevant to this. Remember to explain the effect. It's no use just being able to identify stylistic features. You have to think about what is the effect. And the effect, remember, you're linking back to your thesis statement. Don't panic. I know it's scary. I know that it's a recorded oral exam. If you get really muddled, if you have a brain freeze, if you forget what you're talking about, just stop and pause and take 15 seconds or 20 seconds and reset and think again and start again when you're ready. You're not going to get penalized for sort of taking 15 or 20 seconds to sort of reset. So don't be afraid to do that. Don't panic and start saying the first thing that comes into your head. Try to use technical language. Show off your vocabulary. You're a DP student. I'm sure you have a rich and technical vocabulary. Try to avoid words such as weird and random. And this is one I can't stress enough. Work backwards from the rubric. Have a look at the rubric. Study the rubric. Have a look at the rubric. And this is, available in the DB handbook on the IB website. I'm sure your teacher's given this to you. And work backwards. Look at the higher bands for each criterion and work out what you'd need to do in an IOC in order to get that. And remember that your teacher is there to help you in the second part of the IOC. Okay? And they will ask you guiding questions to sort of eke out a response for parts of the text that maybe you haven't covered in enough detail, or just really to demonstrate your knowledge. So remember, your teacher is there to help. So I'm going to show you a structure now, and this is the structure that I give to my students. Doesn't mean it's the best structure or the only structure. If you want to have a different structure, that's fine. So first of all, we introduce the poem. We then give our thesis statement. We then give a brief background to the poet, and we talk about some of the themes that is prevalent in their poetry. We then mention the structure, then the diction, and then the imagery in the poem. We then conclude and we ask any sort of questions that are still unclear in the poem, are still open to interpretation. And as I said, there are lots of different structures you can use. Some poets like to do this. Some students like to do this line by line or stanza by stanza. Some like to do it thematically. It really doesn't matter as long as you have a thesis statement and you keep on referring back to that thesis statement. So I'm going to give you an example of the thesis statement I'm going to use for this example IOC. And the thesis statement is, in Mowing, Robert Frost illustrates the joy of manual labor through structure, diction, and imagery. And it's a very simple thesis statement. It's not difficult, it's not trying to be particularly complicated. It is a fairly literal thesis statement. And don't feel your thesis statement has to cover all of the poems that you've studied. It's fine if it's a fairly literal, straight to the point thesis statement, because remember, you have to back up this thesis statement with evidence. And Robert Frost illustrates the joy of labor through structure, diction, imagery. It's quite a simple thesis statement, and I'm pretty confident that I can back that up. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to give you I'm going to record an example IOC commentary for Mowing by Robert Frost. I'm only going to record the first part. The second part, the conversation that you'll have with your teacher or examiner, which lasts sort of maybe up to 5 minutes, there's not much point in me recording that because I would be having a conversation with myself. And I'd also know what guiding questions I was going to ask myself, so it would be a bit unfair. But that's the part of the exam where really, if you've been able to make a successful commentary, your teacher's guiding questions will be easy. And remember, as I said before, your teacher's going to help you with this. So without further ado, I'm going to give you part 1 of an IOC for Mowing by Robert Frost. It will hopefully be, about 10 to 12 minutes. It shouldn't be longer than that, but let's see how we go. So, Mowing by Robert Frost is a 14-line single stanza poem. In Mowing, Robert Frost illustrates the joy of manual labor through structure, diction, and imagery. Robert Frost was an American poet who published most of his work in the 20th century. He was named the Poet Laureate of Vermont in 1961. Frost is famous for his depictions of rural life and his deep philosophical questions about society. Probably his most famous poem is The Road Not Taken. Frost's poetry often contained themes related to man's relationship with the universe, the cycle of nature, and man-made and natural isolation. In Mowing, Robert Frost makes use of a sonnet structure to illustrate the concept of his love of manual labor. Mowing is 14 lines, making it a sonnet. Traditionally, sonnets have often had romantic themes, and here Frost writes about his love of both outdoors and labor. Frost uses repetition to reinforce the message of this poem, that manual labor is rewarding. Forms of the verb to whisper are repeated in lines 2, 3, 6, and 14. Whisper is a strange choice of verbs. The action of scything hay produces a sharp sound, yet whispers suggest that the message from the scythe, while difficult to interpret, is almost a treasured secret. The end stops in the final 2 lines suggest a finality to Frost's earlier question, what was it whispered? And ambiguity of the earlier parts of the poem. And the penultimate line, the fact is the sweetest dream that nature knows, is the conclusion and summary to the poem, and that end stop makes the line a declarative sentence. The colon in line 8 shows the relationship between the abstract, where he says, it was not the dream of the gift of idle hours or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf, and the more concrete, anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak, which in this case is the truth that labor is its own reward. And Frost suffered from depression throughout his life, and his family had a long history of mental illness. And one of the natural treatments for depression is exercise. And here he suggests that he is more comfortable with the concrete tasks, such as manual labor and exercise, as opposed to this abstract concepts, such as the search for meaning. And Frost uses perfect and rich rhymes to give Mowing a natural flow. He adds a single perfect rhyme with ground in line 2 and sound in line 5, and adds another in line 6, speak, and weak in line 9, and another with rose and nose in line 10 and 13 respectively. He ends the poem with another single perfect rhyme, snake and make. And combined with the rich rhyme that he puts in line 7, hours and flowers, these rhymes give the poem a natural flow, almost like Frost's progress in his task, and a harmonious sound when read aloud. Frost makes use of imagery, particularly personification, to paint his scythe in a positive light. And scythes are often synonymous with the Grim Reaper and death, although in a way that is what Frost is in this poem. To the row of hay, he is the Grim Reaper. He brings death to it. However, unlike in other Frost poems, like Spring Pools, where he laments the natural cycle of nature as cruel, in Mowing, this is a man-made cycle. And Frost respects clearly the earnest love that laid the swale in rose, as much as he enjoys the action of cutting the hay down so the cycle can repeat. So earlier, where he talked in Spring Pools about how he was sad that nature had this cruel incessant cycle, here, possibly because it's a man-made cycle, he gets joy and satisfaction out of it. And like many of Frost's poems, juxtaposition is used to show the paradox of our lives. So for example, a scythe does not whisper. And whisper is a gentle action, but a scythe is a tool for killing. And so by personifying his scythe as this gentle and wise instrument, he reminds us of the value of his work. In line 8, Frost talks about the Fae, or elf. This is not the only time Frost has made references to mystical beings. If we think about Mending Wall, Frost mischievously mentions elves when he's ridiculing his neighbour's obsession with rebuilding the wall that divides them. But here, they're a metaphor for man's constant quest for meaning in a universe that is vast and indifferent. And here they sort of represent something that's intangible, like the thoughts and questions that drive him to depression. And he's really saying here that these thoughts and this abstract concepts don't compare with the honest, hard labour that planted the field he's in. And he also says that the truth of the Fae or the elf would seem too weak compared to the earnest love, which in this case is hard labour. And the overall effect of this poem is really to remind us of the beauty that we can get in the simple tasks in life. And we can imagine Frost in a sun-baked field basking in the satisfaction of a job well done. And some lingering questions do remain. One of the lingering questions we have about this poem is concerning the bright green snake in line 12. And it does seem out of context with the rest of the poem because it's the only mention to a real living thing in the poem aside from the narrator. Is it a real snake or is it a metaphor? And on one hand, given the fairly literal meaning of the poem, you know, if you link back to the thesis statement, it's fairly literal meaning, it could well be a real snake. But also snakes are very heavy in symbolism, and Robert Frost is an author who does not include details without good reason. And also just the idea that bright green seems a slightly unrealistic colour for a snake. So it does leave us with this lingering question about the snake, which Frost doesn't really mention too much. Okay, so that was just over 9 minutes, and that was the first part of an example IOC for poetry for Robert Frost. And as I mentioned, after this, you would now spend about 5 minutes talking with your teacher, and they would give you some guiding questions. I'm not going to go through that now, but I hope you found this video useful, and good luck in your exams.